Hi everybody, so today I'm talking about bisexual erasure in Orange is the New Black. And when we think about bisexuality, bisexuality is probably most easily defined as the attraction to more than one gender. This is the definition that the Bisexual Index use, and it's kind of the most inclusive definition I could think of. And when I think about bisexuality, this is some of the things that I think about. So bisexual politics, bisexual musicians, bisexual pride and conventions, and personal relationships. But when we look at bisexuality in the media, we tend to get a much more stereotypical image. And a lot of these stereotypes come from the idea that bisexual people are unable to maintain a monogamous relationship with somebody of one gender, and that is obviously what we're all aiming for. And therefore, this leads to the idea that bisexual people are inherently unfaithful, that they're inherently deceitful. Also, the idea that bisexual people are therefore necessarily promiscuous, and that they're also up for kind of any sexual activity that's going. It also leads to this idea that bisexual people or that bisexuality is not actually a genuine sexual orientation, and that at some point somebody's going to have to choose to be gay or to be straight and settle down into either a gay or a straight relationship. And this leads to a lot of the harmful stereotypes that we see about bisexual people. When we look at bisexual representation in the media, what we know is that bisexuality is consistently underrepresented. There have been a few studies looking at this, and in particular there's a study done by Stonewall, which looks at bisexual representation in the media aimed at young people in 2011. What it found was that lesbian, gay, and bisexual representation occurred in, I think it was about 4.5% of characters, but only 0.6% of that was bisexual men and women, which is particularly frustrating because bisexual people are the biggest part of the LGBT community, and yet even amongst other sexual minorities, they're still underrepresented. When we look at bisexual characters, it becomes interesting when I started to think about how we know whether a character is bisexual or not. So in real life, I would assume that somebody was bisexual if they identified as bisexual. But if we were going to go only on characters that identified as bisexual on TV, then we probably wouldn't have a discussion at all. So we can look instead about characters that are seen to have relationships with more than one gender. Interestingly, we could also think about characters that we don't know are not bisexual, characters that we see in relationships with people of one particular gender, but that we don't know if they have attractions to other genders. But in terms of this discussion, I don't think that's really very relevant, because if bisexuality is not being represented, then it's not contributing towards good bisexual representation. And also, since we live in a society that assumes that heterosexual relationships are the norm, I think it's fair to assume that most characters are written as heterosexual unless we are demonstrated otherwise. When we look at bisexuality in Orange is the New Black, our first thought is Piper Chapman, who is a character who's seen as having consistent attraction to more than one gender. But I was actually also able to find a couple more characters who I felt met my criteria of a bisexual character, which includes Lorna Morello and Brooke Soso. When we look at these three characters, I think the first thing that comes across to me is that they're all quite irritating characters in some way. They're also all quite femme characters. They're quite a particular representation of what a bisexual woman might look like. When we look in more detail, we see that both Piper and Brooke are seen as very privileged characters, kind of middle class, a little bit naive. When we look at Piper and Lorna Morello, we also see that these characters both cheat on long-term, or what they see as long-term relationships with men, with a woman, and therefore they come across as deceitful characters. When we compare this to the representation of women who we only see having relationships with women, the first thing that's really obvious is that actually there are far more women who we only see having relationships with women than women that we see having relationships with more than one gender. And when we look at these women, I think it's pretty clear that there's a much bigger range of diversity in terms of character and in terms of just about everything, really. And some of that is inherent, because if you only have 3 characters rather than 8 or more characters, you're always going to have less representation. So I think one of the most important things for bisexual representation is just to have more and more characters out there that are visibly bisexual. And some of that diversity is going to be inherent when you start to have more characters. However, when we look at the way that Piper talks about her sexuality, she never describes herself as bisexual, and actually very rarely does she talk about her sexuality at all. 2 of the cases that she does are on this slide, and I think there are about 2 others which fall into very similar narratives. But what we also see is that Piper is clearly consistently aware and comfortable with being attracted to men and women at the same time. She doesn't seem confused in any way. And she also speaks about the Kinsey scale, I think twice. So she gives this idea that she has some basic awareness of sexual politics, which really leads you to question, why wouldn't she identify as bisexual when she's aware of some sort of basic sexual politics and she's not a confused character? But instead what we see is that Piper's sexuality is defined by other people. In particular, she's consistently described as a lesbian, and the majority of the times that her sexuality is described, it is as a lesbian. Conversely, there are a few times that she is described as straight, usually by lesbian women, in order to insinuate that bisexual people are inherently unfaithful and are going to cheat on their female partners with men. What this does is it refuses to give Piper any agency, and it actually denies her having a real sexual orientation because she's being continually defined by other people as either heterosexual or homosexual. And the narrative or the words that are used to describe her have a massive focus on the idea of turning gay and turning straight and transitioning between being gay and straight and which one is she now. And this kind of hetero-homo binary that's imposed upon her fails to give her any real kind of sexual orientation for herself. This is actually quite useful in terms of plot device as well. So what we see is that Piper's life outside the prison and Piper's life inside the prison are very different. Outside the prison, she's seen as naive, as middle class. She has a fiancé, and she kind of is assumed by her family to be straight. Inside the prison, she has relationships with women, and suddenly her family are worried about her turning into a lesbian again. And she becomes a lot more manipulative character as well. What we see is that Piper's bisexuality really reinforces this tension between her life inside the prison and her life outside of the prison. And this tension is used particularly in the first series for a lot of the script points and a lot of the plot. But there are more simple ways that Piper's sexuality is useful to the plot as well. It allows us to shoehorn romantic relationships into an all-female cast. And it also gives lots of punchlines to the jokes about Piper and about her sexuality. And actually, a lot of the occasions where Piper would conceivably start talking about being a bisexual woman, instead what we see is jokes about Piper being a lesbian, turning into a lesbian, or being straight. I don't think it's inherently a bad thing to use bisexuality in a plot, as long as you also have good representation for bisexual people at the same time. And I hope what I've tried to show to you is that actually we have poor representation for bisexual women, we have stereotypical representation of bisexual women, and yet that bisexuality is really useful in terms of the plot and the script. So there is one character in particular that I wanted to talk a little bit about, because Cal, who is Piper's brother, is often seen as the liberal counterpoint to Piper's neurotic and conservative family. Cal is the guy that we're meant to relate to in terms of script, and often his conversations are the conversations that are often seen as promoting sexual fluidity or even kind of bisexuality. So there's this discussion in particular where Larry and Cal are talking to each other, and Cal says this thing where he says, "I think the issue here, Larry, is that you think someone is to be exactly anything." This is often portrayed as a really good piece of bisexual representation, and actually I'm not really sure that it is, because I think this just reinforces the idea that bisexual people aren't exactly anything. They are part gay and they're part straight, but they're not a sexual orientation in their own right. But what's even more frustrating about this conversation is what precludes it, and which is often cut out of quotes, which when people quote this kind of conversation online, which is that what Cal is saying is that Larry shouldn't really be worried about Piper's sexual relationship with Alex because it's with a woman, so it's not really cheating. What Cal is saying is that relationships between women are less valuable and they're not really a threat to a relationship between a man and a woman. And this isn't just inherently biphobic, but it's actually just misogynistic. It really devalues relationships between women, and yeah, and I think it's a real shame that this character is often seen as a kind of liberal character that we're meant to relate to, but in fact, he's actually just being misogynistic and reinforcing the kind of harmful ideas that I think the script presents. So to conclude, I think that bisexuality is underrepresented in Origins of the New Black. I think it's often represented in a stereotypical way. I think it's useful for the plot, but there isn't really any representation given to bisexual people. And that's what I want to talk about today. Thank you.